into place. And now they are there. I call the Minister to move the first of the three motions. Lee Rowley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move the motion standing in the name of the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities on the order paper be approved. We are today confirming the major parts of the settlement announced in December, as well as reiterating the £600 million additional funding boost announced in January. This extra money for frontline services has been welcomed by local government as important support, offering the ability to further support children, particularly those with special education needs and disabilities, whilst also being mindful of the increased demand for social care. Government always needs to take tough decisions, and despite the suggestions of some in this place, there is always a balance to be struck. Infinite, very worthy demands, but always very finite resources. Nonetheless, we recognise that it is important to support local government in the face of the increasing demands for services, the rising inflation and costs that are the legacy of the war in Ukraine and instability in the Middle East, and that is exactly what we are seeking to do. In recognition of these challenges, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am pleased to announce a settlement totalling nearly £65 billion for local authorities in England for the next financial year. This includes an increase in core spending power of up to £4.5 billion compared to 23-24, a £1.2 billion uplift to the social care grant, which can be used for children's or adult services subject to individual local priorities, an increase in the funding guarantee, which will ensure that all authorities see a minimum increase in core spending power of 4% before any local decisions on council tax rates, additional support for rural councils through a £15 million increase to the Rural Service Delivery Grant, funding worth £3 million to support authorities experiencing significant difficulties because of internal drainage board levy costs, and additional funding for the Isle of Wight and the Isles of Scilly in recognition of their circumstances and their physical separation from the mainland. As a result, available funding for local government in England is rising by 7.5% in cash terms for 24 to 25. I'll be happy to give way to my friend from the Isle of Wight.
I'm most grateful for the Minister's statement. I'm also grateful for the uplift in funding for the island, which, as I understand, higher than average, and we're most grateful, which took place after meetings with myself and other ministers. And I'm also grateful that they've specifically now mentioned and accepted the additional costs that the Isle of Wight faces by dint of being an island, and that we're effectively now catching up with other parts of the UK, other islands in the UK. I'm very keen for this uplift to be seen to be permanent, and then preferably to be build and then to build on that. Will ministers meet with me to discuss ways that we can ensure that the uplift for the island and the recognition of island status is now fixed?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I'm also grateful to him when I was in the post looking at this portfolio specifically for both his invite to the Isle of Wight, his support for facilitating that, and his continued work on behalf of the islands. This change which has been brought forward today by my honourable friend for North Dorset and by the Secretary of State is in direct recognition of the work he has done, my honourable friend from the Isle of Wight, and I'm grateful for it. I know my honourable friend from North Dorset will absolutely meet with my honourable friend from the Isle of Wight to continue that discussion. I'll happily give way to my honourable friend from New Forest.
Very briefly, I mean, is he comfortable that we are persisting with protecting our constituents from the local councils that they elect in terms of the referendum threshold? When are we going to allow local governments to govern and suffer the consequences if the electorate disagree with what they've done?
I'm grateful to my friend for a very important philosophical point that he raises, which is about the balance between local and national government. He's absolutely right to raise it. It is a long-standing principle as part of our local government settlement that we allow local councils the flexibility to be able to make decisions about the finances in their local areas, whilst also taking a general view that there are caps in place around how far they can go. And I will come more to that in a moment in my opening remarks, but he raises an important point, and I know it will have been noted by my humble friend. So, as I say, available funding for local government in England is rising by 7.5% in cash terms for the coming financial year. This is a significant increase that will allow councils to continue to deliver local services. And thanks to the funding guarantee, all authorities will see an increase of at least 4% before any council tax increases are taken into account. We continue to monitor the financial health of all councils on a regular basis, using a range of data as well as through extensive direct engagement. Examples of significant financial failure in local government remain low, but we will take action where necessary, and we will always be ready to speak to councils should that be necessary and should any have concerns about their own ability to manage their finances or the pressures which they haven't planned for. And we do not just provide funding through the settlement. Separate today, we are proud that there is £15 billion of taxpayer funding in a suite of complementary levelling up projects which will help grow local economies, create local jobs, improve local transport, provide local skills training and support local businesses. Real differences to real people's lives and communities all across the country. Since 2021, the Levelling Up Fund has been changing communities across the United Kingdom. £4.8 billion of taxpayer funds allocated to 271 projects, kickstarting regeneration and funding vital projects across the UK. Levelling Up partnerships, delivering regeneration, and 12 investment zones driving innovation all across the country. In addition, £1.1 billion for 55 left behind towns through the long-term plan for towns, which is reviving high streets and tackling antisocial behaviour, and more than 250 venues in addition to be saved through the Community Ownership Fund. Mr Deputy Speaker, I know I speak for the whole ministerial team in saying that we cherish our close working relationship with local government partners. Every year, we have the opportunity through consultation on the provisional settlement to listen to them even more keenly and along with the public, as well as right honourable and honourable members, on the funding proposals for that coming financial year. The responses were particularly high this year at 267. And the Minister for Local Government, my honourable friend, the member for Dorset North, who is sitting beside me, engaged personally with over 90 members and 90 local government leaders. We are grateful for all who responded, and I pay tribute to the work that my honourable friend did in listening in this regard. It was after listening to these views that the Secretary of State announced an additional over £500 million in January. That is £500 million to booster social care budgets, a key concern for councils. We have heard and listened about pressures on social care services, particularly for children, where we know they have increased. The £500 million uplift to that grant announced on the 24th of January can be used for children or adult services, subject to local priorities. This is on top of the £1 billion in additional grant funding for social care in 2024-25, confirmed at the provisional settlement in December. Overall, this means that next financial year, local authorities with social care responsibilities will receive £5 billion through the social care grant, £1.1 billion through the Market Sustainability and Improvement Fund, £500 million through the Discharge Fund, £2.1 billion through the Improved Better Care Fund, and that is on top of local decisions which they make about funding for social care in their area in addition. We recognise that some councils are able to generate more income from council tax to fund social care, and so we have equalised against the adult social care precept since it was introduced, and we will continue to do that in the coming financial year. Sir Roger, and as my honourable friend from the Isle of Wight has already indicated, we have heard through the consultation, and we know through the course of our constant contact with local government partners that the sector is keen to progress across the board, not just in authorities with social care responsibilities. We will support all tiers of government, and for this reason, we announced an uplift to the funding guarantee proposed at the provisional settlement. This means that every council will see a 4% increase in their core spending power before any local decisions are made on council tax. We have also heard about the particular impacts in rural areas, and that's why we've announced a £15 million increase to the Rural Services Delivery Grant. That is making available a total of £110 million of taxpayers' money, the second successive year of above-inflation increases. And in recognition of the unique circumstances facing our island authorities, and their physical separation from the mainland, we are increasing funding to the Isle of Wight and the Isles of Scilly. But we are clear, and we do not hesitate to repeat it today, that this money is for frontline services on which our communities rely. It is not to be put aside for later use, nor wasted on the myriad of council hobby horses and schemes. Taxpayers deserve value for money. So many parts of the settlement, so many parts of the community, so many parts of the local government sector do that brilliantly already. And for the small number who don't, they are on clear notice this afternoon that they must do that. And in order to ensure that that is the case, we are asking all local authorities to produce productivity plans which will encourage them to set out how they will improve service performance and reduce wasteful expenditure. Turning now to council tax. We continue to strike the balance between giving councils the flexibility to make local decisions, to meet local pressures and support the most vulnerable, whilst continuing to seek to protect council taxpayers from excessive increases. Sir Roger, in any constitutional settlement which divides responsibilities between central and local government, it must follow that local government has the ability and the responsibility to raise some of its own funds, and that it is held to account for the decisions that are made to do that. And so this year, like previous years, we have set core referendum principles of up to 3% plus 2% for the adult social care precept. At the same time, Sir Roger, it also remains the case that some council reserves are now significantly higher than prior to the pandemic. For some, that will be for good reasons. But a number of councils have reserves well in excess of 100% of their core spending power, and the latest data shows that around half of all local authorities have seen their unallocated reserves grow since financial year 2019 to 2020. It is for those councils to decide the appropriate balance between council tax increases and the use of reserves to fund services, depending on their local context, although I very much hope that they will consider the unallocated reserves that they have, and I very much hope that appropriate questions are asked in each locality where that applies by those who are interested. At the provisional local government finance settlement, in consideration of the significant failures of a number of councils, Thurrock Council, Slough Borough Council and Woking Borough Council historically, and their need for ongoing exceptional financial support, the government proposed that bespoke council tax referendum principles should apply. We are today confirming those principles. A core council tax referendum of 8% for Thurrock and Slough and 10% for Woking Borough Council. As councils with adult social care responsibilities, Thurrock and Slough will also be able to use the 2% adult social care precept. These councils can make use of the additional flexibilities provided to support their financial recovery. At the provisional local government finance settlement, the department also set out that councils could seek additional support from government via the exceptional support framework, and as part of that process, the government was prepared to consider representations from councils on council tax provision. We can confirm that in recognition of the scale and the nature of the failings of the council and the precarious financial situation that it is in, government has decided not to oppose a request from Birmingham City Council for the flexibility to increase its council tax by an additional 5% above referendum principles to start paying for the historic failures of the Labour Council in that locality. Mr Speaker, Sir Roger, we have heard requests from devolved authorities on the benefits of tax being retained in the area that is raised. The Trailblazer deals with Greater Manchester and the West Midlands are unprecedented in their reach and include a significant transfer of fiscal power. 60% of England is now covered by a devolution deal, up 20% since the Levelling Up White Paper was published. We will continue to expand and deepen local devolution in England through the devolution framework and the work that my honourable friend from Redcar is doing. Finally, Mr Speaker, finally, Sir Roger, I wish to make a general point about how local government is financed. I know that many right honourable and honourable members, as well as colleagues in the sector, have emphasised the need for reform in the system, and I heard that over the period where I was covering this brief, in particular the funding formula. We have heard those concerns loud and clear. Today, we continue to restate our commitment to reform and to modernise the local government finance settlement and the system in the next Parliament to deliver the most effective financial settlements for councils. And I hear noises from the benches opposite. If those benches really wanted to have said at the beginning of this Parliament, at the beginning of the time when COVID occurred, at the beginning of when we asked our local authorities to do the most extraordinary things in their entire time, then that would have been a very interesting position for the Labour Party had it been in government at the time to do. We took decisions which were necessary at the time. We are restating our commitment to reform. That is what a sensible, a proportionate and a reasonable government does, and it demonstrates yet again the difference between a Labour Party that is seeking to play at being a government and will be unsuccessful and the actual difficult decisions that are being taken every single day on these benches. Sir Roger, in a year that has seen unprecedented increases in demand for social care, in demand for housing and other vital local government services, the government has listened and it is providing more support. This above-inflation funding increase will allow councils to carry on delivering local services on which we all depend. And because local authorities must be accountable to local people, we are putting in place ways to make sure that they are working effectively and efficiently. We have a long-term economic plan which is working. We are supporting local councils with what is needed. We are also making sure that they spend wisely. That is exactly what the Conservatives have done throughout this time, what we will continue to do. And I commend the settlement to the House.
Question is the motion on Local Government Finance Report England as on the order paper. Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Sir Roger. Today should and could have been the day the government, after 14 years in power, finally fixed the crisis in local government. And after a lost decade today, they could and should have used today to be the point of turning the tide on the unsustainable and growing crisis in adult social care, children's services and homelessness services, and to finally end the postcode lottery in the vital services which create communities working people deserve to live in. Communities which are clean, green and safe in return for the now record taxes they pay under this Conservative government. Now, after 6 years of single-year settlements, which clearly go well before COVID, today could and should have been the day the government brought forward a sustained multi-year settlement. But on every test, the government have failed. Councils of all political stripes up and down the country, covering cities, towns and counties, are being forced to the edge of survival. We know that councils are the first responder and often the last line of defence for our communities. That they have managed to keep things going for so long is a testament to their duty and public service. And Sir Roger, I want to thank each and every one of them, every councillor of every party and every council worker for the work that they do for millions of people up and down this country. We owe you a debt of gratitude. From waste management to maintaining roads and parks, from providing housing assistance to supporting local businesses, councils are at the forefront of ensuring that communities can thrive and realise their full potential. Now, Sir Roger, contrast this civic responsibility with a government who seem happier treating local government as a political scapegoat rather than as an equal partner. And so what are the support that councils are receiving in this settlement? £600 million recycled from elsewhere, and a continuation of the begging bowl culture that continues on the never-ending loop like Groundhog Day. Sir Roger, in one of the worst cost of living crises seen for generations, it's shameful an indictment that the council tax bill is set to top £57 billion under Conservatives, which is more than twice saw under the last Labour government. It stands as a matter of fact that people are paying more and more for less and less. Added to the biggest tax burden in peacetime, this adds to the struggles that households already feel when managing bills on mortgages, food and energy bills. On top of that, working people will be slapped with yet another Tory bombshell. In fact, council tax bills under the Tories will set to rise by £13 billion over the next 5 years. And it's clear as day that as councils are being hollowed out, and now they're being told once again the only solution is to raise council tax by more and more. The Institute for Government show that core spending power, even after today's uplift, will still be 10% lower than before the Tories came to power. That doesn't take into account even the rocketing demand in social care, children's services or homelessness either. Ad hoc injections of cash, while maybe offering modest relief, is a painful repeat of the sticking plaster politics that have left our country and our politics and public services much weaker. The government's reckless approach is undermining the fundamentals of local public services. Stability is needed to ensure that older people get the high-quality care that they deserve, to ensure that councils are in the best place to give children the protection they need, to help put an end to the crisis of homelessness that this government is perpetuating, and to keep our public services running where the government have hollowed out the system elsewhere in public services. This government's approach is short-term, it's reckless, and it saves nothing. And in the end, actually the cost is huge. And we can see the consequences here today. So, Roger, it cannot be right that there were more Section 114 notices in last year than in the previous 30 years combined. That isn't a coincidence. It's a result of a toxic mixture of the government's financial mismanagement and a deep worrying lack of accountability. And to make matters worse, the early warning system that could have raised the red flag earlier has been dismantled. It's a fact that in 2010, the coalition government announced the closure of the Audit Commission. Now, it wasn't without its faults, and it certainly wasn't universally well received, but the idea that you remove the early warning system in its entirety was clearly going to set up problems for the future. Councils were left to inspect financial risks themselves rather than value for money, or even to address the issues of what is now clearly a broken audit market. And the facts speak for themselves. In 2002-2024, just 5 of the 467 councils delivered their audited accounts on time. Just 1% of councils submitted audited accounts for the deadline. Happy to give way.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way? He mentions audited accounts. I wondered if he has an opinion as to the position of the audited accounts for Plymouth City Council. I was delighted to go to Plymouth on Friday and debated this with the leader of Plymouth City Council, the Labour leader of Plymouth City Council. But it's quite clear that the Labour City Council's accounts have not been able to be audited because there's a question mark over £70 million being moved from capital spend to a pension pot. And as he mentioned audited accounts, I wondered if he has a view to share about his own situation when it comes to the Labour-run council in Plymouth.
Well, I thank the member for inviting me to celebrate the success of Labour in Plymouth and the work that they are doing after taking back control to really show the city leadership. We know that Plymouth is a proud place, and we know that the Labour Party there is making a huge difference. But on the specific of audited accounts, he may want to consult his own government front bench when it comes to the submission of audited accounts, because there is an issue to reconcile here, which is if only 1% of councillors have submitted accounts, how do you break through that bottleneck given the market isn't responding? And that's an issue the government are going to have to respond sooner than later. So I may well advise the member, if I can politely, to withhold his criticism and wait to see what his own government's approach will be on that. I suspect he may well be slightly embarrassed. Give way to the Chair of the Select Committee.
Thank the member for giving way. The Select Committee has done a report recently about local authority audit, and it's a complete mess. I mean, the 1% being the only ones done on time. It's not a party political issue, this. It's across councils right across the country are struggling with this. One of the things is probably low audit fees. But one of the other issues is the complications of valuation of pension funds. And that's what's holding many, many accounts up. And the likelihood is the only way to get through this is to agree accounts which are qualified because the pension fund valuations haven't been able to be confirmed. That's the likely situation we're going to be in. And I hope there aren't party political points made when councils get into this qualification of accounts.
First of all, thank you to the Select Committee for the work that it's done in this area. We, of course, received the report last week on the financial distress in local authorities, and there's a great deal of work done to really understand the detail of that and what the contributing factors are. And there's no doubt that the accountancy regime, when it comes to pension funds, is a contributing factor to the delay in some cases. But we do need to know that councils are financially resilient, that the financial settlement is robust, and that where there are issues, there is an early warning system that allows for those issues to be picked up earlier and, where required, for intervention to be made at the right time, in the right way, rather than seeing now a range of Section 114 notices being issued at a rate not seen for the last 3 decades. I mean, that just can't stand. It's not sustainable, and we look forward to the government's response on that. But on the wider point about cross-party agreement, I think all of us, and certainly the Local Government Association, that is a cross-party organisation, would welcome the day with open arms for party politics to be taken out of local government finance, and for there to be a consensus about how to fund local public services in the future. And I sincerely hope after the next election, when the front bench is in opposition, they do join us in that call. But let's wait and see. But the government will know, and we know, that because of the financial fragility of local councils and because of the lack of that early warning system, it only now takes a small shock to send town halls into meltdown financially, because the resilience just isn't there, and they will know that. Now, the Local Government Association has done a fantastic job at leading from the front on this, ensuring that adequate support is supplied when needed, but they can't be expected to lead the charge on their own, and nor should they be expected to. Councils need certainty and they need stability. They need the fear and anxiety of financial bankruptcy removed so they can continue to deliver for local communities. There needs to be an adequate time provided so that councils can plan ahead for the fiscal year. And that's why Labour would support local councils where the government have failed. Single-year settlements do not provide the certainty or stability needed to plan ahead, and we recognise that councils need something more than that to end this jointed approach. Labour will embed transparency into the relationship between local and national government, as well as moving towards multi-year settlements fundings for councils that allow them to plan well ahead. We will give towns and cities the tools they need to foster local growth and deliver better public services, and Labour will ensure that, should we be privileged enough to course to form the government at the next election, that councils will be empowered to get on and do the job that they have been elected to do. And finally, Sir Roger, we will see a radical transfer of power away from Westminster into the hands of the British people through the landmark Take Back Control Act. But we won't wait. Where we can accelerate improvement, we will do. We want a new relationship between central and local government as genuine partners in power. We want to see the right powers in the right places. Our communities are resilient, and so are our councils too. But we need to do far more to work hand in hand as true partners going forward. Thank you.
Loder.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to contribute to this debate. This debate is the highlight of the parliamentary calendar for me. Relentlessly, year after year after year, I have contributed to this debate with great fondness, and I remember vividly my honourable friend and next-door neighbour, the member for North Dorset, sitting up there last year, advocating for a great rural czar. Well, of course, indeed, we have the great rural czar sat on the front bench nowadays. So I'm very pleased, and not least am I very pleased because I understand that this debate has 3 hours protected time. So I'll try not to take up too much time, Mr Deputy Speaker, but nonetheless, it's very valuable. Now, each year, I stand up here in this place and I look to make the case not just for rural West Dorset and Dorset as a whole, but rural Britain, in what I believe is some of the most important discussions and decisions that we have in this place about enabling the capability of local government. Most years I have stood here indeed, and I have protested, actually, that we in Dorset have been in need of our fair share of government finances, and indeed in many previous years we have not received that fair share either. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to say that today isn't D-Day, today is S-Day, because my honourable friend and neighbour, the member for North Dorset, the knight in shining armour that he is charging over Bullbarrow Hill. He's going through the chalk valleys to Dorchester, and he is delivering to Dorset Council in Dorchester a £4 million boost to its finances. And that is to be greatly welcomed, and my honourable friend and other neighbour, who's not able to be here with us today, the member for South Dorset, he's away on parliamentary business with the Defence Select Committee, has also asked me to reflect these comments on his behalf so that my honourable friend and other neighbour understands full well that we very much appreciate it in Dorset after many years of campaigning for a greater and fairer share. But it is, I think, important to note that we still do need to address the fundamental structural issues that we face in local government funding. And I recognise that that is a vast task to do. That will take considerable work. And I hope that my honourable friend will be able to, in his remarks in winding up, will be able to give not just me, but a number of colleagues who are also here, that real confidence that it is indeed the government's intention in relative short order that we will actually achieve that, and we will make sure that a fairer share of government, of taxpayers' money, is actually allocated to where it is required. £110 million through the Rural Services Delivery Grant is indeed much welcomed, but of course that funding of up to 3.2 million for some areas, including Dorset, of course it's much better, but is it actually enough to deal with the issues that we have to face? And I think there is a real sense from the House, from the discussions that I've had previous to this debate, that actually that is not indeed the case. £1.5 billion for additional social care is enormously welcome. In West Dorset, a third of the community I represent is over 65. It has additional social care requirements. But are we in Dorset really getting our fair share of 1.5 billion when we're talking about a few million? I think that is indeed a question for us to ask. And in the wider context of making the case for rural Britain, I would just like to remind my honourable friends, the minister on the front bench, ministers on the front bench, that both of whom we have had quite high energy debates, I think it's fair to say, about local government finances, both with my honourable friend and neighbour, and indeed the member for Derbyshire North East. But I would just like to reiterate some of the unfairnesses that there remain in the urban versus rural financing debate. The fact that rural areas still receive some 59% less per head in settlement funding than their urban counterparts, and in real terms that's about £111. That rural residents will pay on average 20% more per head in council tax than their urban counterparts, although I have to say we should probably just take Somerset to one side in that assumption. And of course rural residents do receive on average 13% less per head in social care support overall than urban areas, and that is of course very important in constituencies such as mine, indeed his, when it comes to providing social care. Now, the West Dorset constituency, which I'm enormously proud to represent, has an enormous county boundary with the county of Somerset. Many of my constituents use the services and facilities within Somerset, and I know that is the same. Vice versa. And of course, I think it's fair to say that over the last month, many of my constituents, and I know many people locally in Somerset, have looked upon in absolute horror as to how the council tax increases that are being proposed are actually going to affect them. And just to put this into real terms, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and for the benefit of the House, I would like to clarify the extent of which I'm talking about. If you live in Yeovil, you can expect to see a 90% increase in the town council precept. If you live in Taunton, the county town of Somerset, you can expect to see a 200% increase, and that is alone for the town council precept. And just in real terms, that is an increase of £109 to £277 per annum for the town council precept alone. Now, I am very well aware of this because a Liberal Democrat councillor of Somerset actually works in my constituency, and he contributes frequently to the Liberal Democrat leaflets that are shared in West Dorset. And I can quote, and I should say that the councillor concerned is the head of the audit committee of all committees of Somerset Council. And his mantra, and I can confirm, is to raise taxes and cut services, which is definitely what the case is in Somerset, because the Somerset Liberal Democrats said in November 2022 that they needed an additional £35 million because of a financial difficulty which they experienced. There was no reporting of any finances to the council for 5 months, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came a black hole of £100 million. I should be delighted to give way to the honourable lady and my neighbour.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I am a proud serving Somerset councillor and fully aware of some of the issues that Somerset is facing, but these issues haven't just occurred over the last 9 months of a new Somerset Council. They have been very long drawn out, and indeed Somerset faced one of the longest, in fact I think the longest out of any council across the country, of a council tax freeze between 2010 and 2016 under the last Conservative administration, meaning huge pressures for some of the funding in Somerset, and indeed the council under a Conservative administration was nearly drawn into bankruptcy in 2019 due to some of the pressures on adult social care. So would the honourable member agree with me that this is not a party political stance as he is trying to make it, and it is indeed a legacy that has been left by a previous Tory administration, and the issues that we're facing in local government now are across all colours?
Can I thank very much the Honourable Lady for her intervention? And I know full well that she and I frequently are seen in Westminster Hall debating these matters with great passion and great vigour, and I know she feels equally as strongly about these matters as I do, but it's probably no surprise to her that I don't agree with her conclusion about that. The previous Conservative-run Somerset Council and councils left a considerable legacy. They left a considerable legacy in terms of reserves. There were decisions across the board that have in effect reflected the fact that when the Liberal Democrat Council was elected and started serving from last year, we have seen a number of decisions that have been made that have now ended up on the lap of council taxpayers in Somerset. And the reason I am very alarmed about that is because the number of constituents who live in West Dorset who look to see what happens in Somerset ahead of what will be local elections coming forward in Dorset genuinely look on it in great horror to think, actually, is that really, honestly, truly the case? And I'm just going to, I haven't quite finished replying to her yet. And when it comes to looking at Somerset, I would just like to, if I may, further put into context the contrast between Somerset and Dorset in this case when it comes to the finances, if I may. Last year, we in Dorset received just £700,000 in revenue support grant. In Somerset, the council received £8 million. The social care grant for us last year in Dorset was £22 million. In Somerset was £39 million. The high needs funding block, just £48 million for Dorset, yet £74 million for Somerset. and the schools block funding 76 million for Dorset, yet 122 million for Somerset. And I could go on, but I won't, and I'll have to give way to again in just a moment. But the point I'm just wanting to make here is that there is an enormous contrast, and that contrast has been made in relative short order, actually, at what happens when the Liberal Democrats run the council in Somerset compared to what is a long-standing and well financially run Conservative council in Dorset. And on that point, I'll be delighted to give way.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you once again for allowing me to intervene. I think the points that he's making are unfair, and I think there need to be some context in it. He will know, as a Dorset member, that the council tax in Dorset is vastly higher. In the reform of local government back in the 1970s, Somerset was left with mostly the rural county of Somerset, and most of the higher banding in the council tax change in 91 were taken into Bath and Avon. So we have fewer properties in the higher banded rates. So obviously, as a council, we don't generate as much in the way of council tax. But I think that he also needs to remember, when he's saying that this is an issue for Liberal Democrats, we are delivering on a plan that was implemented by the Conservative government against the will of people in Somerset to go to a unitary council. And indeed, we've delivered over half the amount of the £18.4 million worth of savings within 9 months, when they were expected to be delivered, the full savings, within 3 years. The Liberal Democrats in Somerset are delivering.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think it's fair to say to the Honourable Lady that the reality is that the Liberal Democrats are not delivering on the Conservative legacy, and it is very clear for all to see, especially for people who live in Yeovil and those who live in Taunton, that is definitely not the case, and financially it is hurting. It is going to hurt people who are going to see hundreds and hundreds of pounds on top of their council tax because of a Liberal Democrat administration rather than a Conservative administration. And I would like to draw my remarks to conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, because I would just like to say, again, to my honourable friend and neighbour, it is my opinion that he, through his work, is actually saving the people of Somerset from a further council tax hike that the Liberal Democrats want to pile on them of a further 10%. A further 10%. And I'm very grateful to him, and I know a number of my colleagues who are not able to be here are very grateful to him for the work he is doing to actually say, no, the Liberal Democrats have got to be held accountable. They have got to find solutions. They have got to carry through on what was a very good proposal earlier on several years ago. And I hope that not only the people of Somerset will benefit from that, but going forward in the mid to longer term, that the people of Dorset will benefit from his good work as well. Thank you.
The Department for Levelling Up Select Committee, Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Begin by a few thanks. My colleague on the front bench, Shadow Minister, has referred to the report that the Select Committee produced last week, which we made a statement on in this House last Thursday about financial distress in local authorities. I want to put on record my thanks to the staff of the Select Committee and our special advisors for all the work they did to help put that report together. That's really very much appreciated. I want to thank the Local Government Association, and I declare my interest as a Vice President, Mr Deputy Speaker, for all they do throughout the year for local government and helping us and advising us on the challenges that local government is facing, not least with regard to finances. I actually want to thank the Minister on the front bench as well. Not for providing enough money on this occasion, I wouldn't actually go that far, but to say he has been genuinely helpful and open in the way he has approached or been allowed himself to be approached by colleagues across his House to engage with local councils across the country, and also actually myself as chair of the Select Committee, he's been open to discussion and an exchange of views. So I thank him for the way he's approached it on a personal basis. The problem for council, of course, is they aren't just dealing with this year, are they? They're dealing with a problem since 2010 of year upon year of austerity. £4 billion gap now in funding, which 100 million doesn't, of course, go anywhere near filling. The IFS the other day said it was 7 billion, but it's a very much larger sum than the 600 million extra that the Minister has made available. I was a little bit disappointed that the Minister who led this debate for the government started referring to reserves again. When we get into difficulties for local government finance, there's always a reach to councils have got all this money, why don't they spend it? I think remember back when Lord Pickles was Secretary of State, he was berating councils then for not spending all their reserves at the time. Well, I think most of them are quite grateful they didn't in view of what's happened. So some councils have simply run out of money now, and we've obviously seen the Section 114 notices. Other councils are wary of what is coming, and they can see things getting worse rather than better, because that's what's happened year on year. And quite rightly, they are not rushing to spend all their reserves all at once. They are being prudent to a degree, but they can see those reserves running out in 2 or 3 years' time, even the ones that are not facing a 114 immediately. And of course, we've heard from the Local Government Association around 20% of the councils could be facing 114 notices in the next 12 months. It may not be as high as that. Everyone hopes it isn't, but it could be a significant number. And the difference is, of course, that in the last 6 years, we've had 8 councils issue 114 notices, effective bankruptcy. Previous, 18 years, we had none. It isn't just individual councils who have got difficulty. It's the whole system is now broken. That's the reality. And this was the evidence we have. It wasn't just a select committee plucking this information out of thin air. We heard from every sort of council, from county councils, district councils, metropolitan councils, unitaries, London councils, that the problem now is widespread across councils of all kinds. The system is broken. That is simply the reality. And yes, individual councils, Mr. Speaker, have made mistakes, and some of those mistakes have caused those councils to get into difficulty. But as we look forward, it isn't going to be councils who made mistakes alone who get into difficulties. Many councils will simply run out of money, and that is the situation. And they've got no leeway at all, as their reserves have run down, to deal with any adverse consequences and problems that occur. And the reality is that councils have done brilliantly well to survive this long for the most part. Great credit to councils and councillors up and down the country who have managed to keep themselves going and managed to make efficiency savings on a degree and scale which any central government department would be proud of. And that is the reality, because local government has had bigger cuts to its budgets than any other part of the public sector. And of course, the temptation is always to pick on councils, because you can then blame from the front bench opposite the councils for the difficult choices. Ministers don't have to claim responsibility for the cuts that are made. My own city of Sheffield, 30% cut in its spending power. Of course it's made cut to services. I've had libraries close in my constituency. I've seen less funding for tendered bus services. Of course that's happened. The grass is cut less often. The planning department, and it hasn't got as many resources as it had, and it wants more because of the number of planning applications coming in for the redevelopment and regeneration of the city. But they're all consequences that have happened because of these spending cuts. And it is the two things coming together now, the cuts to resources and then the pressure that is coming on from all the things that everyone knows about and talks about. Social care. Adult social care was seen as a developing problem, and it is. Another time, another way of looking at it, of course, it's a great benefit. People are living longer, and the fact they're here to need the care, that's absolutely wonderful. But it's children in care now as well, which is rising faster as a demand even than adult social care. And we looked on the Select Committee about the children with special needs and their education and the costs of transporting them. And there are things that can be done there which aren't just about more money. They're about looking at the provision of care for children and looking at councils collectively providing that, because we could get costs down there. and looking again at the education, health and care plans. And there is a feeling that sometimes it is the more well-educated, more knowledgeable, more affluent parents who see the benefit there of demanding what's almost an unconstrained amount of money for certain education provision for their children. The costs of that are going up exponentially. Those plans have to be reviewed. Of course, we've got to give kids who have got special needs the education they deserve, but perhaps we ought to look at the system that is causing such a massive increase in the costs that are now occurring. At the other end of this, of course, is that as the overall budgets have constrained, as these demands have gone up, what about the ordinary council taxpayer? The council taxpayer is paying 5% extra every year. Those council taxpayers, for the most part, don't receive social care. For the most part, they haven't got a kid with special needs. For the most part, they don't require the homeless services, because that's another area of increasing demand. But they've been asked to pay 5% extra, and then they're seeing their library disappear, their bus service disappear, the streets not swept as often, and they're saying, but I'm paying more every year and I'm getting less. This system cannot continue in the way it is. It's a challenge to the basis of democracy, where people feel they're paying for something and getting it. Here they're feeling they're paying more and getting less. It isn't sustainable in the long term, and I think we can all see that as well. Other problems with the settlement, it's only 1 year. Local governments asked repeatedly for multi-year settlements. We got there in 2016. All right, COVID interfered with that, but there's no reason why it really couldn't have come back since. Fair funding. We were promised that, I think, 2016. What's happened to it? Yeah, this settlement is based on data that goes back to the last century. That can't be right either, can it? I mean, it really can't be right that we're allocating money based on how many people lived in areas so many years ago that it doesn't make any sense in terms of demographic changes since. These are all issues that could have been addressed. They're big challenges, but they could have been met. We haven't mentioned the public health grant today. When public health went over to local government, it was pretty well funded because it got linked to NHS settlement increases. Since then, public health grant, and it's really important public health, looking at prevention in our most deprived communities, has a 27% real terms cut since it went over to local government. And we don't use it enough, do we? During COVID, the directors of public health should have had their expertise used for tracking and tracing instead of the phone banks we set up at national level with billions of pounds of cost. And the director of public health in Sheffield, Greg Fells, sent me the information about the cuts that they're having to deal with. And it's a fundamental issue of equality, because public health is about helping the poorest communities disproportionately, and that isn't now happening with those cuts. Yes, some welcome extra money for smoking cessation and to deal with people with alcohol problems, but it doesn't fill the gap that's been created by the cuts that have been made. Say one thing to the Minister, whether he can have a word with the Chancellor. He probably can't offer us any more money than the 600 million today, but go along and look at the Household Support Fund, which our Select Committee has just written about. This is a fund which in Sheffield apparently provides 32,000 children in the summer holidays with vouchers to compensate. These are children with free school meals when the schools are there, but in the school holidays, of course, the kids go home and haven't got it. Have a look at it. It's really something local authorities can't compensate for in the current crisis. It wouldn't take a lot to simply keep the fund going from March when it comes to an end. And this is the last school holidays when kids will get it. It's a small issue, but I'm sure if the Minister lends his voice, together with the Select Committee and many others across the House to this, we might be able to get a bit of movement of that maybe in the Chancellor's statement that's coming up. Finally, things are bad, but they could get worse, and probably will. The Minister referred earlier to, well, it's the next Parliament, yes. The Secretary of State announced that he was going to ask the Minister to conduct a review of council tax over a year ago. I understand nothing's happened yet. And the Minister made a suggestion the other day. When we do a reform and a review of local government finance, and we've got to do it, It's not been touched for 30 years. You can't explain to someone who gets a new home how their council tax is calculated. You say, well, it's based on the value in 91, but the home wasn't built in 91, but it's still done on that basis. It's a nonsense. We all can see that. And we need to do that reform. I hope, and the Minister made the suggestion the other day, I agree with him, can it be done? Whoever wins the election, cross-party. So you've got to make this stick for the long term. Certainly social care funding, again, you've got to make it stick for the long term. As pension reform was done, cross-party, and it's actually stuck for the long term. So let's have a look at both those particular issues as well. And I hope we can move on. Finally, just to say about the productivity plans, Mr Deputy Speaker, what on earth are they? Hasn't local government got enough work to do rather than having to produce another set of plans for some purpose that only the Secretary of State seems to understand? And I just read a phrase that apparently councils have got to stop spending on discredited equality, diversity and inclusion programmes. I don't know whether anyone could tell me what a discredited equality, diversity and inclusion programme is. And who is going to decide what a discredited programme is? I don't know whether the Minister's got a little list of criteria and tick boxes. Is he going to review all these programmes, or is it just another attempt to say, well, obviously, councils have got plenty of money if they're engaging these sorts of programmes? They haven't, and councils actually, in my view, are engaged in providing proper, decent, needed services for their communities. Not enough of them because of the spending cuts they've had. I hope we can move forward in due course to a better time for local government. Certainly our councils deserve it, but even more importantly, our communities deserve it as well.
Firstly, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Minister, the Honourable Member for North Dorset and the Chancellor for listening to our concerns regarding significant pressures on local authorities, especially those with responsibilities for children and adult social care. I really do welcome the £600 million in extra funding recently announced, with the £500 million of this to local authorities with children and adult social care responsibilities. East Sussex County Council has also very much welcomed the extra £5.386 million that it will be getting. However, despite this extra funding, East Sussex County Council, which is a very well-run Conservative council, has reported that, due to the significant pressures arising from the current economic situation and changes to demography and need, the financial position for the coming year is the most challenging it has seen in recent years. And this, Mr Deputy Speaker, is in direct contrast to the Labour-run Hastings Borough Council, whose independent auditors, Grant Thornton, said, "We have identified significant weaknesses arising from funding gaps and unidentified savings, and the Council's approach to due diligence when undertaking commercial investments, which has resulted in a failure to achieve expected financial returns." The Borough Council is teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, and so the Labour leader and 6 Labour councillors resigned from the Labour Party and set themselves up as Hastings Independents. Their change of name will not absolve them of their failures and refusal to take responsibility for the mess they have got the council in. So back to East Sussex County Council. Although welcome the additional funding, it does not breach the Council's financial gap for 2024-25, and it is for 1 year only. And this means that despite previous careful budget management, the budget for the coming year will still be supported by a significant withdrawal from limited reserves, and there remains considerable uncertainty about funding for future years. This is not a sustainable position at both national and local level, because available reserves would be depleted by the end of 2025 to 26. In its budget and its 2024-25 council plan, East Sussex agreed proposals to spend the council's £538.1 million net revenue budget on services and activities that will deliver its priority outcomes, including funding a range of significant demand and cost pressures being experienced by services. These plans are supported by a 2.99% increase in council tax and a 2% adult social care levy. This decision was not made lightly, given the current pressures on household budgets, but in light of the very significant deficit the Council faces in the coming year and beyond, it needs to apply these increases to safeguard services as far as possible. East Sussex has also agreed an £837.9 million 10-year capital programme, which includes badly needed investment in local roads and highway structures, in reducing the Council's carbon emissions and in school places, including for special educational needs and disabilities. Our potholes in East Sussex, especially in Hastings and Rye, desperately need more funding from national government, and I must emphasise this with a view to the March budget. So we must look at how we fund the particular needs and characteristics of East Sussex. There is an urgent requirement for sustainable long-term funding to meet these needs, and this must be understood by governments that our residents benefit from high-quality services in the future, and this means reviewing, developing and implementing a fairer funding formula for local authorities and for police for that matter, which actually reflects the actual need as well as deprivation, geography, demographic and so on. This is especially important for local authorities with coastal communities, which due to a lack of granular data are often left behind. Fairer funding does not necessarily mean more government funding, as we've heard. It's been focused on more urban areas, but a redistribution or reallocation of existing resources more equitably. And it's very encouraging to hear the Minister earlier outline the plan for a fairer funding formula coming soon in the next Parliament. Coastal communities face unique challenges related to their geography, their demographic, often older population density and economic activities. A fair funding formula would consider these specific needs rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach. Coastal areas often have diverse population, including seasonal residents and tourists. These fluctuations impact service demands, infrastructure maintenance, and social services. A fair formula would account for population dynamics and deprivation levels in these regions. Coastal communities are often more isolated due to their geographical location, and this isolation affects transportation, healthcare, education, and access to essential services. A fairer formula would address the challenges of sparsity and ensure adequate support. Coastal areas require investment in flood defences, coastal erosion management and environmental protection. A fair formula would allocate funds to address these critical issues. And coastal economies often rely on tourism, fishing and maritime industries. A fair funding formula would recognise the need for economic resilience and support diversification efforts. Mr Deputy Speaker, a fairer funding formula is essential to ensure that local authorities, especially those in coastal communities, receive adequate resources to address their unique challenges and focus on actual need and serve their residents effectively. Thank you.
John Morgan.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Like so many other members of this House, and indeed 40 members from the government benches who signed a county council network letter a couple of weeks ago, my local council, which is Shropshire, is cutting services because it's chronically underfunded. And I should just declare my interest as a Vice President of the Local Government Association. Now, I think it's disappointing to try and score political points, actually, across an issue which is so important and affects so many people's lives directly. Because Shropshire Council is Conservative run, and while undoubtedly Liberal Democrats would make different political choices about how money was spent there is no getting away from the fact that this is an issue that affects councils of all types and of all parties, and there is a chronic structural funding issue that we need to address. Most people in Shropshire are paying more for less, and that's because of our social care cost, which amounts to 85% of the budget there. And I'm afraid that no political party is going to be able to solve that issue without additional help from central government and recognition of the social care crisis that's overwhelming councils like mine. But it is worth reflecting for a moment on the amount of central government funding that has been awarded to councils since 2016 and 17 financial year. According to the House of Commons Library, there's been a £5.75 billion decrease in real terms funding. In Shropshire, that's about £37.3 million. And you'll forgive my using a slightly different year. This is House of Commons Library data. Compared to 2015-16, there's a 51.3% less funding per person in Shropshire from central government. And so we need to ask ourselves, how are we going to stop people paying more for less? Because I don't think I have the answer, and I know that the leader and the councillors of Shropshire Council don't have the answer either. And I just want to reflect on what that means for people across the whole country, really. Because if you are getting less services, that drives inequality of all types. So I'm just thinking about swimming pools. Since 2015, the government have said 276 local authority pools have been closed, including one in my own constituency. Now, in my constituency, the Whitchurch swimming pool is being rebuilt, and we're very lucky, but many other places are not going to be so lucky. And that means that people will have been without a swimming pool in my constituency for very many years, and in some places forever. And that means that if you can't get to a neighbouring town, if you don't have access to a car, if you can't pay to go to a nice private swimming pool somewhere, your children won't learn to swim. And that is a fundamental and deep inequality of the type that we should be avoiding. And it's a direct consequence of poor council funding. I mean, another example in my own constituency is that the Civic Centre in Whitchurch, in the same town in fact, has had to close recently because of issues with rat and asbestos. And the council have said that they can't afford to either rectify or rebuild that civic centre because of the interest on the money that they would have to borrow. We're talking about £7 million. So, I don't know, £750,000 a year interest. And they shouldn't be in the situation where they can't provide the cultural enrichment that a town centre needs, and indeed the economic benefit of bringing people into the town centre, because they can't afford what is a very relatively small amount of additional borrowing for something so basic. Now, I mentioned that Shropshire Council's Conservative run, and I've had some constructive meetings with the leader of Shropshire Council, and they've been very open and said that the social care requirement will overwhelm the whole budget in future years unless something urgent is done. There is no amount of paperclip savings that will get them to the point where they will be able to afford our social care budget in the future. And not only do we have an ageing population and elderly demographic, we're also a very rural area, so the cost of delivering social care is so much higher for us, as I know other members have alluded to. That means that carers are travelling long distances between seeing each person, they are having to pay a lot of money in fuel costs. It is just so much more expensive to deliver that social care. And I'm afraid that we need to look at this issue of fair funding, taking into account the cost of delivery of service in a very urgent way, because the 15 million rural services delivery grant increase, while it's welcome, the total budget of 120 million isn't going to touch the sides of the issue that the councils are facing in rural areas when dealing with this social care problem. So I would put it to the Minister that we urgently need him to work with his colleagues in the Department for Health and Social Care for a fundamental reform of how we deliver social care and how we fund it. Because until we grasp that nettle, we aren't going to solve the issue of local authority funding with the odd extra bit of money here and there. You know, Simmonds up in a crisis to prevent a few more councils issuing Section 114 notices. I just want to touch also on children's social care and special educational needs and disabilities. I had a really interesting conversation with a school recently about their budget, and that's probably not a topic for this department. But while the money the school gets to support a child on an EHCP is woefully inadequate, and they make a loss on each child that they're trying to support, that same cost, the £6,000 delivered by the council, is also crippling the council budget. So we really need to have a look at that. But again, I would just urge the Minister to think what that means for individual people's lives. I've just had a case of a young man who's just turned 16. He has a life-limiting illness and severe disability, and his transport funding was cut because over 16 the councils had to make the policy decision to save money that they won't send transport. Now, we have thankfully resolved that situation for this one individual, but there will be thousands of other individuals in the same position across the country, and the impact on the family is devastating. They need to go to a special place during the day for additional care or for schooling. Their parents need to go to work. If that transport isn't there, it's having a fundamental and detrimental impact on that family's lives, and we need to acknowledge that and find a way to solve that issue. Now, the DLUC committee report, which has been referred to by the honourable gentleman already, has said that SEND support is an issue that will lead councils to a cliff edge of Section 114 notices, and we really need to address that problem. I also want to touch on the problem of housing, which obviously affects those district councils and unitary councils that have to deal with the temporary housing problem. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Eastbourne District Council organised an event in Westminster where they invited council leaders of all parties and from all parts of the country to come and discuss this issue of temporary housing and the impact it was having on their budgets. And it was a really, really well-attended event with a good deal of cross-party agreement. And I was a bit disappointed not to see a minister there to talk to those council leaders on that day. But to give you an example, Eastbourne is spending 48% of its budget on temporary housing. It's not sustainable. Even in Shropshire, which I don't think would be counted as one of the councils that has the most critical issue of temporary housing, we've seen the numbers of temporary accommodation double since 2018. So it's also extremely important that the government grasp this issue of social housing, housing for social rent, because these people in temporary accommodation, which is often unsuitable, inadequate, not anywhere any of us would be satisfied with living, could be solved by investing in social housing. We have a plan to deliver 150,000 social houses a year by the end of the next Parliament, and to put that into context, it would save, according to the House of Commons Library, £11 billion a year of housing benefit that currently ends up in the hands of private landlords. So it's an issue that makes economic sense to resolve, and I would really urge the Minister to consider that. So, in conclusion, and I'm aware that there's a degree of repetition of the points that other members have made, rural councils are struggling to meet the needs of an ageing population, an increased cost of delivering those services, and they are struggling to plan with this problem of a single-year settlement and no certainty about what happens after next year. Shropshire Council is trying to save £50 million this year, £1 million a week of cuts to services that people have paid more for. And they don't quite know what they're going to cut next year. That's the reality of it. And I'm afraid that suggestions that they might dip into reserves or capitalise use some of their capital budget for revenue or sell off some of their assets, it's a one-stop solution, and it doesn't solve the ongoing structural deficit into the years ahead. So once you've sold your library and spent that money on social care, what do you do the following year? There's no library left to sell. And it's really important that we don't try and plug this gap with short-term fixes and address the structural problem affecting our councils. In the meeting I had with the council leader, I was told that a 30% increase in council tax in Shropshire would be required to plug the gap, and people would still see a cut in services. It's clearly unsustainable and unacceptable. Going back to this point about the difference between rural and urban councils, the Rural Services Network have said that urban councils get 38% more. And we shouldn't be having an argument about robbing Peter to pay Paul, because those urban councils are in crisis as well. We need to look at the overall cost of delivering services and find a solution to deal with the fundamental drivers of increased cost. Now, I know that the Minister has been a councillor. I know that many members have been. And regardless of political party, no councillor has taken the step of getting themselves elected and putting themselves on the front line to charge their own residents more and deliver less. And we should be considerate of those individuals in that situation and address the fundamental drivers of this crisis affecting councils of all parties and in all parts of the country. And to reiterate, those issues are social care, they are children with special educational needs and disabilities, and they are housing. And I would urge the Minister to work with his colleagues in those relevant departments to come up with a long-term fundamental reform of those areas to solve this crisis.
Thank you. Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I start by drawing the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Interests. There's an old saying that we can tell the state of a civilization by the condition of its public toilets. And that is often one of the services that the wider public and the voters associate with local government, that alongside potholes. But as has been very well reflected in this debate, local government finance is a huge part of our overall government and public sector expenditure. The vast majority of it goes not on public toilets or on libraries or on potholes, but on the care of the most vulnerable people in our society, around 70-75% of the average local authority's budget on that. And all of it is hugely influential in the quality of life of all of our constituents, because it affects everything from education to the built environment to the nature of things like parks, sports facilities that are incredibly important in people's day-to-day lives. So it seems to me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's important to start in that context by recognising the positive news which has been contained in this statement, and that is the recognition by government that on those core statutory services around adult and children's social care, that cost pressures are becoming unsustainable, and that that's been acknowledged with a significant extra injection of cash. And there will be a huge debate about whether that amount of money is sufficient to address the concerns or not, but it does demonstrate that government is recognising the impact that those unsustainable cost pressures are having and addressing them. Now, it does, of course, continue to create a pressure that legislation around the setting of council tax requires local authorities to undertake their consultation with their residents in the autumn, around October, before the council tax is set by law the following February. So we are quite late in the day to be factoring in the additional funding announcements, welcome as they are. So I would reiterate calls from many sides of the chamber that the earlier we can get any of these announcements into the system, the more they can be structured into a multi-annual financial settlement, the more efficient the use of those resources will be and the greater the benefit to our constituents will be. It is always immensely challenging running around trying to get road contractors to do some extra potholes at the tail end of the financial year. But if you know you have extra money coming down the tracks, you can invest in things like jet patches, one of the things used both by Helen and Harrow for many years, as a means of proactively getting out there and dealing with pothole repairs before the condition of those roads deteriorates any further. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to pick up a couple of issues in a little more detail, some of which have been touched on and some of which I hope will be fresh to the chamber. And the first of those is the impact that the deficits on the dedicated schools grant higher needs block has on the funding announcement that we are debating today. Now, for many, many years, since the days not just back before 1991 and the setting of the council tax bands, but since the very earliest inception of business rates, the funding of education has been based upon the business rate take from a given education authority's area. And that carries through today in the form of the dedicated schools grant, and is the reason why we see such differential funding rates from local authority area to area for education. However, around half of local authorities are now seeing significant deficits on the dedicated schools grants. And whilst the dedicated schools grant and the education budget generally sits with the Department for Education, for the purposes of local government law, it has to be covered by the annual balance requirement that is covered when the council tax is set by that given local authority each February. So if there is a substantial deficit on that budget, which is pretty much entirely under the control of the Department for Education, then significant savings have to be made in the general fund, which is covered by this statement today, in order to make up for it. Now, that's been dealt with in recent years by an annual renewal of a disregard that essentially says to the accountants, the monitoring officers in local authorities, you simply have to allow the DFE to carry this forward and don't allow it directly to impact on your council tax every year. But there is no absolute certainty about the long-term position with the impact of the dedicated schools grant. And the efforts that are being made by local authorities, borrowing against their own revenue budgets to fund an expansion of capital investment to create more SEND school places, a subject of a Westminster Hall debate with my constituency neighbour this afternoon, whilst that will begin to have an impact in bringing those costs down, it remains a very significant financial risk to local authorities. And I think it would be helpful to hear from the Minister, if possible today, but from the government before too long, that that will be addressed and that there can be some certainty for local authorities around that long-term position, not least because of the impact that it has on the balances held by local authorities around the country. And it was great to hear the member for Sheffield South East make reference to public health, which of course remains a key responsibility of local authorities. The COVID pandemic rather brought that into the light once again, and the capacity in particular of local authority and public health team test, track and trace services, which have been there for many years, was clearly critical to the national response to COVID. But it also highlighted the fact that as a country, we went into that pandemic with a population that was on the whole a bit less healthy than in many comparable countries, and continued investment in that public health function to ensure that, in particular, our children are able to enjoy a better degree of general health in the future will mean that we are much more resilient as a country in the face of future challenges in this respect. But Sir Roger, Mr Deputy Speaker, turning to the funding formula itself, I think it's important to recognise that one of the major challenges which all members, I think, reflect in the way that this comes forward and the way that it impacts on our constituents is that there is an enormous amount of historical inequity in the way that the local government funding formula operates. And that has a number of different manifestations. A lot of members have talked about the rural versus urban and suburban impact. Now, I have to say, having served alongside some others in this room over the years at the Local Government Association, this was a pretty much annual subject of lobbying to ministers, and a number of studies were done on the rural, urban, suburban differential. And I think the reason why many of those didn't really see the light of day was the conclusion was that there wasn't, in the end, very much difference, that the challenges that arose from higher degrees of density, particularly the consequences that had for the delivery of all kinds of public services, were pretty much in balance with the equivalent challenges that arose from a greater degree of geographical sparsity in rural areas. And those studies tended to look at the costs of a whole variety of different public services. But what is also really clear is that the move to a significant level of rises in council tax will raise very significantly different amounts extra in different parts of the country. So I represent a constituency which is in a relatively prosperous London suburb covering 2 local authorities. But even in London itself, with 33 local authorities, we see a differential where the last calculation that was done, a 2% rise in council tax would create, for the one that generated most of its money from council tax, which at the time was Richmond, an additional 1.8% increase in its revenue budget, so disposable money to spend. And for the City of London, which was largely dependent on government grants, an additional 0.02% increase in its disposable income as a consequence. And across the country, we see that magnified. So the ability to raise money in a local authority with a very large number of Band A properties is going to be much, much less than a local authority with Band G and H properties, like the constituency that I represent. So whilst it will help, it isn't going to be a long-term solution. And we need to find a way to address those differentials for the long term. And I'd like to express my very strong support for both ministers, the department, and also our Prime Minister, who did come in for a bit of criticism for saying, I want to get to grips with the way that the funding formula historically has divided up funds. Now, I spent my time as a councillor for all but one of the years of the last Labour government and then most of the years of the coalition. Every year was a challenging year, but there was enormous frustration during those years of the Labour government with the fact that most additional funding was not placed, as we are debating today, within the core funding settlement. It came in the form of additional grants that were routed to local authorities on the basis of needs that were not needs reflected in the statutory obligations of the local authority. So if you were a seaside town with lots of elderly people to whom you had a statutory obligation to deliver adult social care, or you were an outer London suburb with a very large number of children placed there with significant care needs to whom you had a statutory obligation, you got no extra funding at all. But if you were an urban city in certain parts of the country where there was a genuine issue perhaps of poverty and housing need that needed to be addressed, then you had often more money than you could possibly spend. So many local authorities will have spent every single one of those years having to make cuts to statutory services whilst being given additional grants for things that were less of a priority. And I think it is enormously welcome that the government is beginning to get to grips with that and saying that the way in which the money flows must first reflect the legal obligations which Parliament has placed on those local authorities. If we say in this House that adult social care, children's social care must be delivered to a certain standard and driven by a certain cost, then we must ensure that the money is flowing in that direction. And I would just gently say that this is a pushback. A couple of members have mentioned the point about equalities. Now, I had the joy of being a peer reviewer for the Equality Standard for Local Government during my time as a councillor. And there has been some criticism, some implication perhaps, that councils are wasting money in this area. One of the reasons why councils do things like equalities impact assessments is to avoid expensive legal challenges of the kind that used to be extremely common, that cost council taxpayers huge amounts, that obstructed the reform in particular of social care services. And if those officials in the town hall are ensuring that in the way that contracts are tendered, that is done in a way that reflects the diverse needs of a community and also ensures that they are not going to be tangled up in years of legal challenges on the basis of the Human Rights Act or any other element of equality legislation, then that increases the efficiency of service delivery by that local authority. And we should be cautious of assuming that if it comes with an equalities badge, that in some sense it must be a waste of money. So moving to a conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, funding reform is going to be enormously welcome across the country. And the key things that I would like to ask the Minister to reflect on as he embarks on that process is firstly that the work that's already started of ensuring that local government funding reflects the cost drivers arising from legislation passed by this House is absolutely critical. If we say that this must happen, it must be done by local government, then we must ensure that the resources are there for the delivery of that. Otherwise we create an unsustainable and bridgeable gap between our constituents' expectations and the funding that is available. Now I suggest that as the bigger picture of reform is taken forward, that we look at the role that planning gain will play in the way that local authorities are funded in the future. It remains the case that despite economic development being an enormous priority for our government and for our country, that most forms of development are a net cost to local authorities. And in Hillingdon, we certainly had this spelt out to us very starkly in respect of Heathrow Airport, campaign for expansion, debate nationally about whether that was an additional benefit to UK PLC or not. But it was extremely clear, especially because the business rates all went to central government, that the expansion of Heathrow Airport simply created significant additional costs to the local authority. And a recent study pointed out that it was estimated that each new citizen moving to a city represented an additional £15,000 per annum cost to the public services of that city, after all the benefits of the taxes they pay and all the rest of it have been taken account of. So we need to make sure that as development proceeds, that there is a real benefit to our constituents, and that therefore local authorities and their local members of Parliament, instead of standing up in this House and saying we want to see more housing, we want to see more economic development, and then being on leaflets in their constituency opposing all of that housing and all of that development, are able genuinely to look their voters in the eye and say, if we get this new factory, it will be disruptive, but the money from it will mean we get a new bus service or an improved GP service or whatever it may be. And in particular, there will be a lot of detail which the Minister is going to be looking at, but I would ask him in particular to reflect on the impact that funding temporary accommodation costs from the general fund of local authorities is having. The housing revenue account is ring-fenced. We know that that comprises both the rents that are paid by the tenants of the local authority, but also a number of other funding streams. However, the fact that it is ring-fenced and often significantly in profit has encouraged governments in the past to look at it as a source, for example, of funding borrowing to invest in housing. The temporary accommodation challenge that we face, especially because of large numbers of people arriving at the UK in fairly short periods of time, exacerbating some pre-existing challenges, is very, very significant and is acute. And I would urge the Minister to look at whether there is some additional flexibility around the housing revenue account that could begin to relieve some of the pressures on the general fund that, again, this motion refers to. And I'd like to finish my remarks, Mr Deputy Speaker, with a thank you to the people that serve in all local authorities in general, but also those in particular who serve as councillors in my constituency and lead my two local authorities. The feedback that I receive from constituents, despite all of the potential gloom and doom about local government, continues to be extremely positive and often improving. People see that their streets are becoming cleaner, their place, their environment is being cared for. That is incredibly important to them, often far more important than the issues that we are debating here in this House. And we owe them a huge debt of thanks as fellow elected politicians.
Rachael Maskell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I just say it's been a pleasure to listen to the member for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, as it always is, and indeed all honourable members, as they've brought forward case for real reform, which we are seeking from the Minister today. And I appreciate his listening to the debate. City of York Council, like so many, it's a small authority, but it really is on its knees. The last Lib Dem Green administration did drain the reserves, and therefore real pressure has been brought on the new Labour administration. And I'm grateful to Councillor Claire Douglas as she has taken up the leadership in York for the work that she is doing to try and ensure that we address those big issues of inequality that our city face by driving through innovation, not least already delivered the lift on the blue badge ban, delivering free school meals into schools of greatest deprivation, and reforming services. However, it is really apparent to all of us that local authority funding is not only insufficient, but the funding formula itself needs real redress. And it's just sad that we've had to wait 14 years to get to this point, and we really do need to see that reform brought forward. And I agree, if there can be cross-party talks, even at this late hour, we would welcome that, because clearly to meet those statutory requirements are incredibly challenging for all local authorities. And whilst York will scrape through this year and avoid a Section 114, unlike other authorities, we know that the starvation of funds from central government has meant that the city is under significant stress. However, I have to say that if we don't address the funding formula, then we're all going to struggle. And it's not just for local government. It crosses all areas in design and how it operates. And therefore, I really do ask that the Minister considers this with other colleagues, because I know the funding formula isn't working in health, education, police, fire, as well as, for instance, the broad rental market area, which I'll return to shortly, putting more and more pressure on local government as they not only integrate more their services with those of others, but also have to address those challenges. And York is by no means the poorest place, but no means the most affluent. We're a post-industrial city in the north, and we experience many, many challenges, and yet we are the worst funded upper-tier authority if you put all of those services together. And that doesn't ring right, it isn't right, because we've got some of the deepest areas of deprivation in the country. We're the 8th lowest upper-tier authority, local authority, if it stands alone. In real terms, it means that my local authority is 33 million worse off than 2010, but if accounting for the rise in service demand in adult and children's social care, that's 40 million since 2010, and yet that funding is so needed. If we look at education, and I'm grateful to what was said about the dedicated schools grant, we're the 17th lowest in the country, again not adding up to the needs that we have, and sit in the bottom third for SEND pupils. And of course, we know the real stress in that area, and we need the Education Secretary to step up and really invest in these children, because we are seeing a significant rise in the number of children with SEND, and in York, higher than across the country. So we really do need to understand why that is, but also how we fund that. And indeed, I know the issue of transport to schools is an area which falls on local authorities, and again is under significant stress. And I also would say around EHCP, the plans which children have to get additional services from from different agencies, the appeal process itself, 98% of appeals are successful, and yet the cost to local authorities, to parents, to children, to schools, to all agencies does not add up. And therefore, we really do need to see reform and to ensure those children get timely support, which we know is so needed. We have an ageing population as well, like many rural areas. It happens in urban areas too, of course, as a country, but again, rising faster in somewhere like York. And of course, the pressures now falling on social care budgets is significant. And what I would say, again, in that spirit of cross-departmental working, we know that the health sector has invested heavily in emergency departments and at the front door of hospitals. But of course, it is the back door of hospitals which needs the funding. That's social care. A quarter of the patients in York Hospital are waiting for discharge. If that can be sorted out, then what we will be able to do is see our NHS functioning. So again, that spirit of cross-party working is so needed in the light of where we are today. But having a plan there will take the pressure off elsewhere on that wider piece of government funding. And the same goes with police and fire funding. And again, I must highlight that, and I had a really useful conversation with the former Home Secretary around this, that if we don't fund correctly local authorities around youth services, then we are paying out of the police budget. So all of these things are interconnected, and that's why I urge the Minister not just to look at local authority funding, but in the round. And of course, public health, another example. And of course, that moved into local government for a reason, as Professor Sir Michael Marmot would highlight, to address the social determinants of poor health, to ensure that people can have greater equality and address those issues around longer healthy lives. But if we're not making the right investments, then we will see the fallout into other services. Again, really, really crucial. But I want to understand why we are having this real disparity in the funding formulas. And we've heard today, obviously, the council tax regime introduced in 1991, business rates as well, massively challenged. And I'm really pleased that our front benchers said they're going to reform in that area because we need that reform urgently. And I would just add to the Minister, and he will know that York is a place that floods. I'm really grateful for the support we've had to build those flood defences, but now we fall below the threshold for the triggering of the Bellwyn scheme. And for those businesses which still flood, they're not getting the support they would have had otherwise. So it seems there is a perverse incentive almost. So it would be really helpful for that, but also to ensure there is business rate relief for flooded businesses while they're not able to trade. And I'd be grateful if he could perhaps comment on that. Just turning to the broad rental market area. York is an incredibly expensive place to live. And bearing in mind what I've said about it being a post-industrial city, it is driving people out of our area. We don't have the supply of social housing we need right now. And as a result, the local housing allowance, just £650 for a two-bedroom property, and yet the cost in the private rented sector, £1,026. The disparity is such because the broad rental market area is just too broad. And as a result of that, people are being either pushed out, which is impacting on our economy, a very kind of low-wage economy comparatively, the gig economy, hospitality sector, retail, and tourism. And this disparity is then putting more pressure on local authorities to then have to find the support for housing and address increasingly homelessness issues as well. So again, out of kilter, we need to bring these things together to ensure that the system works for local government. But if I look as well at my own constituency compared to York Outer, the inequality in the area means that the centre of York is where the greatest strains are felt. And we know clearly that those strains are falling on families right now. And I really would urge, again, the Household Support Fund is brought forward. And if the Minister can have a word with the Chancellor around that, ahead of the forthcoming fiscal event. It would really help our city. And there was a debate in Westminster Hall last week, but that disparity, again, needs addressing for people in my constituency. And we know that the fair funding formula, and it's disappointing to hear that that's not going to happen in this Parliament, that we are going to have to wait for the next Parliament, and I know my honourable friend heard that message clearly as well, does need to be brought in. And of course, right across the piece, I just look at what happens in health, whether it's under the PCGs or the PCTs, which we were back in the day. My predecessor, Sir Hugh Bailey, made the case that York, of course, being the lowest funded in that arena, also fell out and put those pressures back into local government. Ironic in the light that the Carhill formula, which drives the health funding formula, was devised by the University of York Department for Health Economics. So somehow that perversely meant a disadvantage. But what we have seen, of course, under these recent times, is real pressure being brought on services. And I just want to highlight what this means to York. So children's social care, a 15.8% increase. Now, I congratulate our team in the council because they have cut agency spend. I met with the Director of Children's Social Care just the other day, and he said they've got 2 agency staff left in that department. He's cleared out the agency staff to cut costs. So where is that additional headroom going to come from to pay for that? Adult social care, rising 12.5%. And we know social protection housing services, a rise in 26.1%. Minimum wage increases, 9.7%. Last April, 9.8%. This April. It all adds up if you think the average rise, which local authorities are getting around 4%. So that's squeezing the resourcing more and more, and the disparity is having its toll. We need to protect those most in need, and certainly in the voluntary and community sector as well, to ensure that we keep the vitality of that sector at hand, because clearly they deliver so much. But we need a cushion, not a knife, and the fact that we have got those challenges of cuts rather than protection is extremely worrying. And I noted the Minister in opening talked about those other forms of revenue which local authorities have had, whether it's levelling up funding or the Towns Fund or High Street Fund. Well, York hasn't had any of that money. It seems that it's more received according to political affiliation rather than need, and we have therefore missed out on that, so haven't had the additional resourcing being put in place either. So after 14 years, not only do we need more in the funding in numerical terms, but a funding formula that works. And if that is for the next government, we will deliver that because it is so urgent and overdue. My constituents are smart, they know what is happening, and they're really concerned. They're feeling the pinch, they're being stretched as far as they can, and we need to ensure that they get the opportunity. My constituents deserve so much better, and my constituents deserve now a Labour government.
Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to make a contribution to this debate, and it is a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady. I was absolutely delighted when my great friend, the member from North Dorset, got appointed to his ministerial role. Not just because he is a very, very good friend of mine, who was indeed a good friend before either of us were elected to this House, first in 2015, but also because he has been a warrior on this very backbench ever since he was first elected to this House for rural councils. And therefore it was no surprise whatsoever with the way that he then engaged with colleagues in recent weeks with regard to the funding settlement for councils, and particularly with regard to the allocation for rural councils, and to see him work tirelessly to secure some additional funding. So I want to place on record my thanks to him for the way that he listened to colleagues and the work that he did to secure some additional funding from the Treasury, and this has been hugely welcome in Cornwall by Cornwall Council. The almost additional £6 million that we are going to be receiving has not completely filled the gap that we were facing, but has certainly been a huge help and has gone a long way to addressing the funding concerns that we had going into the next financial year. But that does not remove the long-term challenges that we really do face in Cornwall with regard to delivering public services. You all know, Mr Deputy Speaker, I had an adjournment debate 2 weeks ago where I laid out very clearly the many challenges that we face in Cornwall, and I won't bore the House by repeating everything I said on that occasion. But we do face a perfect storm of a unique combination of factors in Cornwall, of an ageing population. I believe our elderly population is now 24% of the population, which is more than 6% higher than the national average in England, and the pressure that is putting on social care. Cornwall Council is now due to spend £256 million in the coming year delivering social care, which is 1/3 of its revenue budget. And that is clearly an unsustainable position for a unitary council. But also the challenges being a rural and coastal county with a long, narrow peninsula, and all of the challenges that place on delivering services, that combination of being both rural and coastal, really does put challenges on us. And that's why, although I very much welcome the additional funding that's being made available through the Rural Services Delivery Grant for this coming year, this is not a long-term sustainable position, and that's why we really do need this fair funding review that particularly addresses the needs and challenges that rural councils face in delivering the services into the future. I know we were expecting that in 2021, and for very understandable reasons following the pandemic, we weren't able to do that, but I would not be being honest to myself if I didn't say that I am not disappointed that by now we've not been able to deliver this, and I really do urge the government to make sure that we come forward with that as soon as possible, because what we're facing in Cornwall is an ongoing challenge of trying to meet the ever-growing demand with the resources we have to face. And what that is actually doing is placing more and more demand on the council taxpayer. The council tax in Cornwall is now 39% higher than the English average. And that is simply unfair to the council taxpayers of Cornwall, that they're having to pay a far bigger proportion of delivering local services through the local council than those in other parts of the country, particularly in urban areas. And I would just gently say to the Shadow Minister that he seemed to, in what he was proposing, seemed to think that somehow that funding that doesn't come through local council tax but comes through the government grant somehow isn't taxpayers' money. The news is they are both taxpayers' money, and is about where that balance sits. Government money from local government in the funding supplement is not free money, and if we want to increase that, then clearly we have to pay for that somehow. And I assume the only way the Labour Party would propose paying for that would be raising other taxes, so the taxpayer would pay. What I'm calling for is a fairer distribution of the funding that is available. I'm not talking about necessarily hiking up the government's contribution to the funding of local government. I'm talking about a fairer contribution, a fairer distribution of the funding that the government makes available to accurately reflect the need, the demand and the cost of delivering services in rural areas. So whilst I massively welcome the Rural Services Delivery Grant and the uplift that's been announced for this coming year, I do say this is not the long-term solution, and we really do need to address the fundamental issue of funding for local councils and rural areas. There's one final thing I'd like to just add into this debate before I close, and that is regarding temporary accommodation, temporary housing. We face a massive issue in Cornwall because many people see Cornwall as a wonderful place to come. Every year we see many people come to Cornwall who then require emergency housing, and this puts a huge demand. I think the last time I had the figures, we had about 1,000 people in Cornwall in temporary accommodation. And again, this is unsustainable for the council. The cost of delivering that temporary accommodation in a largely tourist area is astronomically high because of the way that people who need this temporary accommodation have to be housed. We also have a particular problem in St Austell where the council over many, many years have sought to house a disproportionate number of people in temporary housing and indeed supported accommodation in the town of St Austell, which it has had a huge impact on that community just because of the sheer numbers that are placed there by the council. And local residents of St Austell regularly tell me, although they're happy to play their fair share in providing this form of accommodation that's clearly needed, that they are unhappy when they are expected to provide a disproportionate amount of accommodation in this way, and the council really do need to look at this. It's disturbing that when I ask the council for accurate figures about how many people are actually placed in by the various providers in St Austell, they don't seem to even be able to provide an answer as to how many. We just know it's an awful lot, and the impact that this has on local services, particularly GP services, and the police and the antisocial behaviour that gets associated with this, is really getting to a point where local people are saying they've had enough of this, and we do need to see this matter addressed so that the number of people the council place in St Austell is reduced and reduced as soon as possible. So to sum up, I very much welcome the uplift that's been announced in the funding settlement for this coming year. It's hugely important to Cornwall Council that this additional funding has been announced, but I still await this fundamental review of the funding formula to make sure that going forward we don't just rely on extra pots of money announced, but there is a real review and a fair funding settlement for Cornwall Council in the future.
Dyke.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I was very pleased to debate with local government finances in Somerset with the Honourable Member for West Dorset at the beginning of this debate, but it would have been better if some of his Somerset colleagues, I think, were here to do that with me. Now, it's easy, isn't it, to criticise and burden local government with the blame, but let's face it, it's just the perfect scapegoat to distract from the real term cuts inflicted by this Tory government. Now, as you know, I'm a proudly active Somerset councillor, and I have had the pleasure and honour of serving in my local community, both in Somerset Council and in this House. And I know in Somerset, councillors of all colours are working hard to deliver for their residents. But the funding system for local government is simply broken. And I'm desperately concerned for the future of local government. It needs major reform. Mr Speaker, I've spoken on the issues facing Somerset Council on multiple occasions because of the national problems facing all local government. The Council has had to declare a financial emergency just last year due to the £100 million funding gap for 2024-25. And the Government has offered a £5 million payment to try and plug this gap, but it's woefully inadequate. And while the additional support through the financial settlement is welcomed, it is simply not enough. And I thank the Right Honourable Member for North Dorset for engaging with me and with the Council. It is very much appreciated across the county. But unless the government can provide substantially larger funds, it will not work. What we need...
Member give way?
Yes, of course.
Order. Order.
The honourable gentleman has been in the chamber for about 5 minutes. I do not expect honourable members to walk into the chamber to seek to support colleagues on an intervention. Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. What we need to see is fundamental change to the way we fund local government. Across the country, we have an ageing population. In Somerset specifically, it is forecast that with the 75-year-plus age group, will double over the next 25 years. The demands of adult social care are becoming more complex and the costs are rising. We can no longer fund such an important and expensive service through council tax based on house prices from over 30 years ago. In Somerset, the issue is particularly difficult. Historically low council tax rates and a damaging 6-year freeze under the previous Conservative administration have left the Band D rates in Somerset almost £260 lower than in its contiguous neighbour Dorset. The rurality of Somerset also provides specific challenges because it costs more to provide services in rural areas. The council just cannot make enough money locally to fund adult social care. Now, having spoken recently to the leaders of Somerset Council, they described the situation to me as grim. They have to explain to residents why they will be paying more in council tax but receiving less, as cuts to discretionary services are being considered. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a nationwide issue that requires a nationwide solution. 9 councils have essentially gone bust since 2018, and the recent Levelling Up Housing and Communities Select Committee report painted the critical situation currently facing local government. Now, I'm thankful to the committee for their report, which recommended urgent reform to the way local authorities are funded. When I speak to my colleagues in local government, many of them share these concerns. I've been told that some think it's now impossible to solve the crisis in local government through local funding. Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to highlight what our future could look like if we fail to reform local government, if we fail to provide both statutory and discretionary services, and if we fail to look after the communities that we hold dear. Our communities will be left with high streets full of boarded up businesses as the outdated business rate system puts pressure on entrepreneurs without adequately funding councils. Our fields will be littered with household waste from fly tipping as councils shut down recycling centres. Our streets overflowing with rubbish from uncollected bins, and our town centres bereft of quality libraries, and our roads full of even more potholes. As councils struggle more year on year to fund adult and children's social care, SEND and housing, these services will undoubtedly deteriorate. Much of what I have mentioned is already a reality for millions around the country, and it's simply terrifying to think how much worse it could get. Council leaders have told me we need a long-term solution, but politics is a short-term game. The government have been reluctant to approach this issue seriously with a long-term plan, as evidenced by their unwillingness to follow recommendations by the Levelling Up Housing and Community Select Committee and publish a 10-year plan to tackle the long-term funding of adult social care. So, Mr Speaker, I will conclude by calling for cross-party unity to work together to solve this issue. This is something we must do for our communities, and I know councillors of all colours want to continue to provide the best level of services for their residents, and I know councils of all colours are aware of the specific challenges they are facing. We must ensure councils are adequately funded in the long term so that essential reforms are realised.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way? And I appreciate the point she made. And much of what she says, I agree. I just wanted to briefly say to her that. Oh, I beg your pardon.
Point of order.
I believe the Honourable Lady had finished her speech.
I beg your pardon?
I believe my Honourable friend had finished her speech. She wasn't accepting an intervention.
Are we saying that the Honourable Lady had sat down?
Yeah.
Yes, I just finished my speech, Deputy Speaker.
You can't possibly have an intervention. Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. This settlement is welcome in that, for many councils, it does stave off financial Armageddon, but we do need as we've been hearing, to be adopting a far, far more strategic approach to the funding of local councils and how they deliver the crucially important services that they provide. Mr. Deputy Speaker, year after year, we go through an annual routine of the government issuing a provisional local government funding settlement in December, which presents many councils with significant challenges. This is then followed by an intense period of lobbying by councils, their representative bodies and by MPs. Government then finds some more money, which solves the short-term challenge. We then agree the settlement as we will do tonight. Life goes on, and then we repeat the whole exercise again the next year. As we have heard, and I think there is consensus across the chamber, this is a cycle that we must break out of. A county such as Suffolk faces significant challenges. An ageing population, which means that there is an ever-increasing vulnerable group of people who require care and support. Whilst it is right, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that my right honourable friend the Chancellor increased the national living wage in his autumn statement, it was wrong that in the first instance councils such as Suffolk were asked to fund most of this increase themselves from their existing resources. We do need to pay properly and support those thousands of workers going out in all weather conditions to care and assist vulnerable people in their own homes. Suffolk, like Cornwall, like Somerset, like Dorset, covers a large geographical area, and it is expensive to deliver services in such circumstances, including, as we've heard, home-to-school transport and SEN provision. Faced with these challenges and with an initial inadequate provisional settlement, Suffolk County Council cut their funding of arts and heritage. The latter, in particular, leaves the Waveney and Lowestoft area poorly and inadequately served and resourced with regard to archives and records, and I'm sure that's an issue I will return to again in due course. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, he is right to set up an expert panel to advise on financial stability and to also ask local authorities to produce productivity plans, but much, much more is required than this. And as I've said, we need to move away from the current short-term approach to local government funding, and in doing so, I would suggest the following changes should be considered. Firstly, as I think a lot of people have said, there should be multi-year financial settlements rather than the annual settlements that we have had for the past 6 years. Secondly, we must recognise the added cost of delivering services over large rural and coastal areas such as Suffolk. Thirdly, working in conjunction with the Department of Health and Social Care, the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities must provide a sustainable long-term plan for social care, with care workers being fairly paid and being provided with proper career paths. There should also be a review of statutory responsibilities in such areas as home-to-school transport, so as to ensure that they are properly funded. And finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as we have heard, the government should carry out the relative needs and resources review, the so-called fair funding review. This review should look not only at the opaque and complicated formulas that are used, but also the data which was used for the assessment of relative needs, which, as we have heard, dates way back from so much of it from the last century. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I move on to my conclusion. In his summing up, I do hope that my honourable friend, the member for North Dorset, who has, I think, taken extremely well to his new role, is able to herald in this long-term strategic approach that local government so desperately needs. Thank you.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I just take a few minutes of your time, if I may. Just first of all, to register my members' interests with members here today. Although I'm no longer a borough councillor, I was until last May, and I understand I have to still report it until 12 months have passed. I would like to thank, first of all, the Department, Dyke, and ministers past and present, because £600 million additional money is a significant increase and very, very welcome indeed, and thank you very much indeed. I'd also like to thank, in particular, Leicestershire County Council, Charnwood Borough Council, and my parish and town councils, and those across the whole of the county. My colleagues there do wonderful work, and so do the officials, and I'm much appreciative of what they do. Now, I won't go into too much detail about the issue about fairer funding, because it is well rehearsed with ministers past and present from all of the Leicestershire MPs who have lobbied continuously since 2019 and before I was here, I understand, with many a minister, many a Secretary of State and many a Chancellor as well. So all I would say is fairer funding formula. The operative word is fairer, and it's not being met at the moment. So if we're able to do something about that in the future, the very near future, I would be most grateful. Certainly, the well-rehearsed arguments on the rural area member for West Dorset mentioned, I thoroughly support what he said. And also my honourable friend, the member for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, always worth listening to him, and many of the things he talked about was exactly what I was going to talk about as well. But I don't like to moan. I prefer to come up with a solution if I possibly can. And so what I would like to suggest is something along the lines of the member for St Austell and Newquay in the police debate earlier on this afternoon talked about the police having their resources being used by other departments, such as Department of Health. And I think that's the same with Dyke and indeed council resources. And the member for York Central alluded to it so somewhat with the EHCPs. Now, I did a surgery last Friday evening, 8 slots, 2 of them about EHCPs, exactly the same the week before, and it was 3 EHCPs. And I think there's something about the County Council having statutory responsibility for delivering EHCPs, and yet health can say what they want to within the H part of an EHCP, and yet do not have to deliver those resources. The County Council feel they have to. And that puts additional cost and additional time on that 20-week window for an EHCP. And I'd like to see something done about that. So the department that asks for the thing to be done actually pays for it. And the exact same thing happens with my borough council with supported housing benefit, where the DWP, because I have some charities which are not registered social landlords, the council cannot claim the whole of the benefit back from the DWP, and are therefore out of pocket by about £1.5 million. Well, that is simply unsustainable on a budget of about £16 million a year. And so what I'd like to be able to see is that instead of deluxe customers, councils, paying for those things, the department that wants those things to be done pays for those things. And so when the Minister at the beginning, the opening remarks, talks about spending being on frontline services, I absolutely agree with that, but also spending by councils on things that they want to do, not necessarily not being able to get money back from other departments. And that's my conclusion. Thank you.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Sir Roger. For 14 years now, ministers from this government have come to the House to lay out their plans for local government finance. And for 14 years, there's been a constant theme throughout: sticking plaster policies. Instead of providing the certainty and stability that local government is crying out for, the government have again laid out proposals that have been chopped and changed in admission of their own failure. And while councils of all political stripes are left shelling out millions, and communities and service users pay the price, I don't believe for a moment that ministers have taken the steps necessary to end this crisis. A crisis compounded by spiralling inflation and a failure to grow our economy, where councils are spending eye-watering amounts on temporary accommodation, and where at any moment the next domino could fall and another council could be on the brink of collapse. This is not sustainable, Mr Deputy Speaker. Local authorities need a government that will support them with a long-term plan, because we are under no illusions about the scale of the problem. I will give way.
Grateful to her giving way. Given the need for a long-term plan, were Labour to win the election, how much extra would local government get in the first year of a Labour government?
Well, as I will come on to say shortly to the honourable member, we will have a review to look at the long-term plans, and we understand the problems that local government are facing. So, as we've heard from honourable members on this side of the House, we've heard from the chair of the Select Committee, the member for Sheffield South East, who set out comprehensively a summary of the issues facing local authorities and councils generally, and thanking councils and councillors for carrying on and doing the work that they need to do to run the councils. And he reminded us, too, of the impact of the public health cuts as well, which local authorities have seen. And then the member for York Central referred to issues in her local authority and the gap between rising need and funding available. Like others, many other members mentioned as well, SEND funding is an issue, and also that public health issue impact again. So we can all understand that there's no magic wand and there's no quick fix. But if the government is prepared to work with councils to build from the ground up and to deliver the services taxpayers need and deserve, I truly believe that we can bring an end to this crisis. And yet, over this last decade, the government have abandoned any interest in this kind of cooperation and instead torn down the protections which were meant to prevent a crisis like this. They've ripped away, as we have heard, any financial oversight of local council spending, scrapping the Audit Commission and pushing councils to borrow more and more. They've left councils without a functioning early warning system, meaning they can't even sound the alarm when struggling. We cannot go on like this, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that's why a Labour government would instead prioritise stability and greater certainty, unlocking multi-year funding settlements to give local taxpayers better value for money, fixing our broken audit system to restore genuine oversight and partnership with local government, and prioritising certainty and stability over this government's narrow and short-term fixes to problems of their own making.
Thank you very much. Minister.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to wind up for the government in this debate. I'll just say gently, if I may, to one of my shadows, the Honourable Lady, the member for Blaydon, that if the situation was as bad as she paints it as being, as did her honourable friend, the member for Oldham, I'm slightly surprised that with the exception of the front bench and the honourable gentleman for Sheffield South East, and I say this as a former Select Committee chairman, one's obliged to take part in these things when it's one's department, against all this horror that we have heard, we have had one Labour backbench contribution. So I thank and congratulate the honourable lady for York Central. At least there's one Labour member who is concerned about local government, who isn't obliged to come and talk about it. But what an exciting prospect we have, Mr Deputy Speaker. The nation sits agog. 14 years of opposition and a review to look at long-term plans is what the honourable lady, the member for Blaydon, tantalisingly holds before the House and the electorate. 14 years of opposition, Mr Deputy Speaker. One does have to ask, what on earth have they been doing with the time? A review to look at long term plans. As always, the Labour Party quick to critique, slow to deliver. What a contrast to the speeches that we have heard from this side of the House. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of course I'll give way to the chairman.
Mr. for giving way. No, just thinking back to the beginning of the debate, I actually think I heard the Minister who opened for the government talking about doing a long-term review of local government finance in the next Parliament. Difference, of course, that they have been in power for the last 40 years when they could have actually done something about it.
Well, as the honourable gentleman well knows, because he and I have discussed this on many occasions, and I know that he broadly agrees with me on this point, I think chief executives and councils of local and leaders of local councils would have come at the department with pitchforks and flaming torches if we had dumped a 200-page consultation document on their desks at a time when they were rallying to the cause to support their communities during the COVID crisis. So this year, as last year, the government has set its focus, and I believe rightly so, on stability and certainty and security. And in this local government finance settlement, I believe we deliver on all three. No. If he can't be in for the opening, he's not taking part in the summing up. He's tried that trick before and it didn't work then. What I do welcome, and we heard it from the Honourable Lady for North Shropshire, we've heard it from the Chairman of the Select Committee, and indeed from the front bench. Some of these issues that we are talking about, it came through in the consultation, it came through in the engagement. Support for special educational needs, a long-term view for adult social care, reform to the formula, which so many of my honourable and right honourable friends and across the House have referenced. The very best way, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of delivering on that is, I believe, through cross-party working. It does provide the stability and the security to our local authorities, and I think that is what this House owes them. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I was asked to take on this job, I absolutely had no idea of the complexity and length that arriving at a local government finance settlement would have. I just want to thank all colleagues who came along and took part in my parliamentary engagement. It was hugely helpful. I do want to pay tribute to my private office and officials in the department. Long hours, huge work. I pay particular tribute, not least because her note here tells me I have to
and the Minister is their boss.
To Victoria Peace for all of her hard work, to Kate, to Nico and to others. It has been a truly team effort. I also want to thank my right honourable friends, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister, for listening to the case that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and I took to them with regards to revisions to the formula. We said that we would listen, we did, and we have acted. That, to me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are the hallmarks of prudent, listening, caring, one-nation conservatism, and it is writ large in this local government finance settlement this afternoon. I also want to pay tribute, as so many others have, to the work day in and day out that councillors and council officers do, delivering for local people, some of the most vulnerable in our societies, to make their lives more bearable, their lives a little bit better, and to create a sense of place in which people wish to live. We salute all of them. Are all of them brilliant? Of course not, but there again, not all of us are brilliant in this space. But what I do know is that day in and day out, they focus on doing their best. I'm very grateful. I've been called many things, but genuinely helpful is what the chairman of the Select Committee called me. The great rural czar in a knight in shining armour from West Dorset, and my honourable friend, a warrior for rural councils, for my honourable friend from St Austell and Newquay. I'm grateful for those. I look forward to them being carved into my headstone in due course. Not too soon, I hope. I could bore the House with the figures for each local authority where people have made contributions, but they are on the public record. They are on the public record. They are all in the positive direction. I think we have started to make significant inroads in addressing those concerns by turning our thinking to the common themes which have ranged through this debate. Send, adult social care, those are trajectories which show no signs of abating, and we do need a long-term solution for that. The formula does need reform, and the government is committed to doing just that in the next Parliament. I would say to all of us that the transformation plans and the productivity plans, which we see as being a key part of the settlement, is all part of underscoring the fact that the agenda for change is a process, not an event. It has to be iterative and organic, because as my honourable friend, the member for St Austell and Newquay referenced, we have no money and councils have no money save that which we raise through the taxpayer. We have a duty to ensure that we can deliver the biggest bang for each and every buck. My honourable friend, the member for Hastings and Rye, the member for my honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, for the honourable lady for Somerton and Frome, my honourable friend, the member for Loughborough and for Waveney, all reference the important points in that formula review of ensuring that we take into account the differentials in the demand of need in delivering services in a rural or a coastal area. I do not believe, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we would be right in any definition of that term to say that need in an urban area outranks that in a rural area or a coastal area, or vice versa. Need is need, and our local authorities want to play their part in making that difference. My honourable friend, the member for Loughborough, was absolutely right. She was not the only one to mention it. I certainly take it on board of the need for other government departments to, when they create a new burden or a duty on local authorities, to take into account the budgetary impacts that those services have. And my honourable friend, the member for Hastings and Rye, I believe, made that point as well, and I agree with all of them who have made it. The Honourable Lady, the member for York Central, asked a specific question with regards to the flood recovery framework and business rates. I'm delighted to confirm to her that 100% business rate relief is available to businesses for a minimum of 3 months that have been flooded, and that rate relief can continue to an agreed date until the business is able to be reoccupied for trading. So I hope that that gives some comfort to her and to her constituents who have suffered from flooding issues in the recent time. So a lot has been done. Services can continue, but the need for reform, cross-party working, blue skies thinking and significant change remains. But this settlement is a generous settlement. More than £500 million, or just £500 million, Mr Deputy Speaker, available for children's services and adult social care. My honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, long advocated for the Rural Services Delivery Grant. That is up now to its highest level, £115 million. And I know that rural councils, including the honourable ladies from North Shropshire, will have welcomed that fact as a useful means of supporting their service. We understand, applaud and appreciate the important contribution that councils make across our country, the difference that they deliver for their communities. We understand, and we are going to work with the sector leaders, council leaders and others to ensure a bright, secure and stable future for local councils. A £600 million uplift, on average 6-7% increase in core spending power for most councils. This is a fantastic opportunity for councils to continue to deliver, for us to support them, and I agree. I close with the point which many have made, that we will deliver better for our constituents when we work in partnership, central and local government, matched horses pulling in the same direction, serving our communities and making a vital difference for those who need it. I beg to move.
Well, the debate could have continued until 8:10, so no one... Get back. No one is more grateful than me. The question is the motion on the Local Government Finance Report. England is on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. No, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Minister to move the second motion formally.
Formally.
The question is the motion on the referendums relating to council tax increases Principles England report as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. We know. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Minister to move third motion formally.
Formally.
The question is the motion on the referendums relating to council tax increases alternative notional amounts England report as on the order paper. As many of that say aye? Aye. We know. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 4 on business of the House today. Minister to move.
Formally.
The question is as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. We know. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the motion number 5 on the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill carry-over extensions. I call the Minister to move the motion.
Move formally.
The question is the motion on the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill carry-over extension as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the motion number 6 on the Victims and Prisoners Bill carry-over extension. Call the Minister to move.
Formally.
The question is the motion on the Victims and Prisoners Bill carry-over extension as on the order papers. May I say aye? Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 7 on gender recognition. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 8 on insolvency. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 9 on insolvency. Minister to move.
I beg to move.
Question is as on the order papers. May I say aye?
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.